The morning sun cast long, solemn shadows across the undulating hills of Ironwood Valley, Montana, as Wade Thorne stepped onto the creaking wraparound porch of his time-worn ranch house. The familiar weight of a mug filled with black coffee warming his hand, while his steel-gray eyes, still sharp with the predatory intensity of a man who had once stalked war in its purest form, scanned the horizon not with the gaze of a farmer, but of a sentinel standing at the edge of an old battlefield. At 58, the graying hair and corlused hands betrayed a lifetime of violence, carved into flesh and memory, 3 decades of bearing America's darkest burdens in silence, and yet no insignia, no patches, no relics of rank adorned his home or person. Only the land, the silence, and the cold morning wind bore witness to the legend who had once been known as the Phantom, the name whispered in Pentagon corridors and cursed in the final breaths of enemy commanders. For Wade, these 2,000 acres of pristine soil were never just farmland. They were a sanctuary, a fragile attempt at redemption, a quiet place to drown out the gunfire that still echoed through his sleep. But some men don't get peace, only intermissions, and on that very morning, as he sipped and watched the mist lift from the valley floor, the war he thought he'd left behind was already drawing near. 300 miles to the south, in a nameless warehouse buried in the outskirts of Billings, Eduardo El Lobo Vasquez, 42, cold-eyed, ruthless, studied satellite images of the Ironwood property like a predator tracing a scent trail, his scarred fingers gliding over the printed terrain as he spoke to Miguel Santos, his second-in-command and former Mexican Army sergeant turned Sicario tactician, laying out the strategic perfection of the land they intended to claim, dismissing Wade with chilling confidence as just another stubborn old rancher soon to be brushed aside by the 30 cartel enforcers waiting for their signal to descend. But what they didn't know, what none of their intelligence could fathom, was that the man sipping coffee from an unmarked mug wasn't a farmer clinging to habit. He was a weapon dormant but never disarmed, and as Carlos Mendoza, the cartel's lead scout, lay prone on a distant ridge, with high-powered optics trained on Wade's every move, radioing in with arrogant certainty about the predictable morning routine of their target, he remained oblivious to the fact that Wade's perimeter walks were precision patrol, his livestock care a cover for surveillance sweeps, and every step across his land a calculated rehearsal for war. Then came Tuesday morning, a faint whisper of tread patterns near the eastern fence line, military spec tires, convoy space load-bearing grooves, and while any other man might have dismissed them as hunters or hikers, Wade dropped to one knee, fingers tracing the fresh impressions in the soil like a priest reading scripture, and in that moment, something ancient stirred within him. The facade cracked, the heartbeat quickened, the breath deepened, and as he rose to his feet, eyes narrowing on the distant ridge, the soldier within him, the Phantom, awakened with chilling clarity. That night, one encrypted phone call pulled old ghosts from their scattered corners of quiet life, and when Master Sergeant Jake Bulldog Morrison answered the line with a voice laced in sand, blood, and loyalty, there was no hesitation, only the promise of steel, and within a day the old pack had assembled, each man stepping out of the shadows carrying more than duffel bags. Tommy Chaos Chen, silent, brilliant, explosive-minded, a ghost from cyber warfare and sabotage. David Fisher, sniper, phantom, hunter, his bones etched with patience and precision, and Jake himself, the unshakable wall who had never lost a man without carving the memory into his soul. Maps were unrolled, comms locked in, frequencies monitored, and as Wade stood before his brothers in arms, the house transformed into a tactical nerve center, humming with controlled urgency. He laid it out in sober clarity. This wasn't just about land. It was about containment, about preventing a cancer from metastasizing across Montana soil, and the fight when it came would be surgical, savage and final. That night Fish vanished into the darkness wrapped in a ghillie suit, moving through terrain like smoke on the wind, confirming cartel surveillance teams, positioned on the ridgelines, with night optics and encrypted radios, unaware they were now being watched by the deadliest trigger finger the U.S. military had ever produced. Wade's response was immediate. Initiate Phase 2. Within an hour, the old farmhouse had become a fortress, silent but prepared, humming beneath the floorboards, with stored firepower and minds sharpened by decades of warfare. And as the sun rose the next morning over Ironwood Valley, casting a golden sheen on dew-soaked grass, Wade moved through his routine like a man chasing peace, feeding livestock, inspecting the barn, but every gesture, every pause, every look toward the tree line was part of a larger pattern, a quiet dance of reconnaissance and readiness. Then came the order, 11400 hours, El Lobo's voice crackling through cartel radios, with arrogant confidence, as his teams advanced from the north, south and east, 27 armed men sweeping across the land with deadly precision, expecting an old man in overalls, and perhaps a weak show of resistance, but instead walking straight into the jaws of a kill zone, crafted by warriors who had once painted entire cities red and left no footprints behind. The war had come, but it had not come quietly, and it would not leave without remembering the name of the man who waited for it with fire in his soul and fury in his blood. Wade stood in the stillness of his kitchen, the steady hum of the refrigerator, and the rhythmic clink of utensils on the countertop masking the gathering storm beyond the hills, his hands moving with deceptive ease, as he sliced through the silence, until Tommy's voice crackled through his earpiece like the spark before an inferno. "Boss, we've got movement on all frequencies. Multiple teams are converging from the north, south and east. I count at least 25 hostiles, possibly more." Without hesitation, Wade's reply came calm and resolute, the voice of a man who had faced chaos so many times it no longer stirred his pulse. "Gentlemen, it's showtime. Execute Phase 1 defensive measure. Jake, you're on the western perimeter. Fish, take over watch position Alpha. Tommy, maintain comms, and prep the fireworks, light them when I say." He set down his coffee mug with finality, a hollow sound against the wood, then moved to the window with slow deliberation, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of the pistol concealed beneath his shirt, his eyes scanning the tree line like a hawk awakened from hibernation. "Let's remind these bastards why they should have stayed south of the border." And then, without ceremony, the sky cracked open. A single shot from Fish's hayloft position ripped through the valley like a divine edict, through their Winchester Magnum round, slicing clean through 800 meters of crisp Montana air before striking the lead scout in the chest with brutal efficiency, the hydrostatic shock erupting in a crimson plume that painted the earth and wildflowers beneath it, his body dropping so abruptly that Miguel's team stood frozen in momentary horror, the pink mist of his final breath glowing in the afternoon light like a grim sunset. "Contact north, hostile eliminated," Fish announced over the radio, his tone surgical, his detachment unnerving, the voice of a man for whom death was a practiced art. The cartel operatives scattered, diving behind logs and boulders, their panic bleeding through the radio as Miguel barked, "Sniper on target. We are engaged by a professional marksman." This is not what we were briefed for, but the trap had already been sprung, and what they had thought was a quiet ranch now revealed itself as a fortress sculpted by decades of warfighting instinct. Wade's voice cut through the team's comms like a blade, his tone laced with the fury of righteous resistance. "These foreign invaders made a fatal mistake. They brought their war to our soil, believing we would cower behind fences and fear. But today, they learn why the Phantom became a legend, why men like us haunt the dreams of warlords and tyrants." Show them what happens when predators mistake American wolves for sheep. Show them why we are the ones who guard the guardians. Weapons free, no mercy, no quarter. Make them remember this day in whatever hell they believe in. And with that, the four warriors moved with haunting precision. No longer just veterans, they were reawakened titans. Brothers forged in blood and fire, executing their craft with the terrifying grace of men who had outlived 1,000 battles. As Carlos's southern team crept within 200 meters of the house, the earth itself betrayed them. Tommy's IEDs erupted in a sequence of calculated devastation, the first explosion launching 2 men backwards, their limbs torn and screams silenced in midair. The second blast tearing through a group seeking cover behind a fallen log, the shockwave turning wood and metal into shrapnel, their hiding place into a coffin. Southern approaches lit up, Tommy reported, his voice low with grim satisfaction, as if he had just finished a sculpture and stepped back to admire the destruction. And from his command position, El Lobo watched the massacre unfold with a rising sickness in his gut, the illusion of control evaporating as half his force lay dead or dying, and the house they sought to overrun stood untouched, defiant, a monolith surrounded by fire and ruin. All units concentrate fire on the main house, he roared, panic sharpening his tone. I want that building turned into Swiss cheese. And so the remaining operatives opened up with everything they had, streams of automatic gunfire lighting the sky like a funeral pyre, the thunder of bullets echoing through the valley. But behind those walls stood something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Not a farmer defending property, but a predator defending purpose. A soldier reclaiming his place at the gates of hell. Wade had expected this moment long before it arrived, and as the first rounds tore into the ranch house like a hailstorm of steel and fury, he moved with the lethal grace of a man who had rehearsed every variable, every angle, every possible contingency in his mind 100 times over. For 3 quiet years, he'd reinforced the structure in secret, embedding hardened steel plates behind the rustic wooden siding and replacing every pane of glass with ballistic armor, designed to shrug off high-caliber impacts while still appearing like weathered ranch windows. And now, as hundreds of bullets peppered the walls in a chaotic barrage, Wade ghosted through the interior with predatory efficiency, returning fire from reinforced firing ports with an M4 carbine that sang with controlled bursts, each shot deliberate, each target acquisition immediate and final. Tommy, suppression fire on the eastern tree line, he commanded over comms, voice unshaken by the chaos. Jake, shift fire to the north sector. Fish, take their leaders off the board. Outside, the valley became a crucible of fire and death. Cartel gunmen scrambling beneath a sky now painted with lead. The carefully orchestrated defense turning every direction into a killing field. For 2 grueling hours the firefight raged, a contest of will and endurance, as the Americans, vastly outnumbered but infinitely more skilled, dismantled the assault with surgical precision, their rifles speaking in deadly rhythm, their coordination honed by years of fighting in places the world pretended didn't exist. El Lobo, once so certain of his dominance, now stood in disbelief, pinned down behind his smoking command vehicle as the reality of the slaughter unfolded around him. Miguel's last breath had already fled behind a cattle trough, a perfect hole drilled between his eyes, courtesy of Fish's unerring scope, and Carlos had been reduced to bloody ruin by the shrapnel of one of Tommy's perfectly timed secondary charges. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the sound of gunfire dwindled to isolated cracks. 27 had come, only 8 remained, and most of those were bleeding in the dirt. From the ranch house, Wade's voice boomed through the valley via a jury-rigged bullhorn, calm, cold, and merciless. Attention cartel scumbags, you have 60 seconds to surrender and live, or you die where you stand. Shoot. The reply came as expected with venom and defiance. Vete al infierno, gringo. El Lobo's final insult echoed over the valley, punctuated by one last desperate burst of automatic fire. Wade's response was swift and clinical. Wrong answer, amigo. Gentlemen, finish them. What followed was not combat, it was execution. Fish dropped 2 sentries with clean headshots, their skulls snapping back before they hit the ground. Jake flanked south, cutting off the escape route with relentless fire, while Tommy's final surprise, a line of claymores set along the rear approach, shredded the last wounded runners in a brutal crescendo of concussive force and flying steel. In the stillness that followed, El Lobo found himself utterly alone, his tactical gear stained with dust and fear, tattoos marking him as a king of blood in another world. But here on this ground they meant nothing. Wade approached steadily, rifle up, his silhouette framed against the last rays of twilight, as his team closed off every possible retreat. Eduardo Vasquez, Wade called out, voice low but thunderous with meaning, a.k.a. El Lobo wanted for 47 murders, drug trafficking and human smuggling. You picked the wrong ranch. Confusion flickered in El Lobo's eyes. How did this old man know so much? But Wade was already closing the distance. Every step the echo of decades of judgment, rendered in foreign lands. You want to know who you're dealing with, Wade said. Name's Wade Thorne. Call sign, Phantom. 30 years hunting monsters like you in deserts, jungles and mountains you've never heard of. You made 2 mistakes. First, you brought your war to American soil. Second, you brought it to my doorstep. El Lobo's hand inched toward his pistol, but Jake's voice from the flank cut through like a razor. I wouldn't if I were you. You're already dead. You just haven't hit the ground yet. In a final act of desperation, El Lobo lunged, drawing fast, but Wade was faster. 3 decades of combat muscle memory collapsed into a single pull of the trigger. 45 caliber slug slammed into El Lobo's chest with brutal finality, lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling in the dirt, limbs twitching, blood soaking the earth he thought he would own. Wade stood over him, a living monument to retribution, his voice measured, steady, devoid of pity. You came here thinking we were sheep, he said. But this land was built by warriors, defended by warriors, and it will always belong to warriors. You should have stayed in Mexico. El Lobo gasped one final promise of vengeance, but Wade had heard it all before. He turned his back on the dying man without a second glance. The cleanup began immediately, efficient and precise. The 4 operators, veterans of countless off-the-books engagements, erased every trace, bodies hauled to remote sites, equipment catalogued or destroyed, vehicles reduced to slag by controlled detonation. By dawn, Ironwood Valley looked as it always had, still, serene, untouched, but beneath the surface, blood had soaked into the earth, and ghosts lingered in the shadows of the barn. Wade knew this was far from over. El Lobo's death would spark questions, and the silence surrounding his disappearance would only draw more eyes. That was the plan. Over the next 48 hours, the team transformed the ranch into a hardened fortress. Weapons caches hidden under hay bales and floorboards, interlocking fields of fire mapped out, fallback points established, communications lines resecured through encrypted law enforcement contacts, who understood the stakes, but asked no questions. And then Friday came, and with it, the second wave. Captain Raul Gutierrez, El Lobo's superior and one of the cartel's most brutal tacticians, rolled into the valley with 50 men in full kit, probing the land with military precision, searching for answers in the dirt and echoes in the trees. But what they didn't know, not yet, was that they had just stepped into a battlefield already shaped, already claimed, already owned by 4 shadows, who had buried armies before, and were ready to do it again. Wade observed their approach through high-powered binoculars, from the shadowed loft of the barn. His eyes narrowed, every movement of the incoming force dissected with the cold detachment of a man who had made a career of measuring threats before extinguishing them. The way they moved, the tight formations, the disciplined spacing. It was clear they were not like the last wave, not reckless sicarios led by a swaggering fool, but hardened professionals executing a playbook designed by someone who understood how to wage war. "They're better," Wade said grimly during the pre-dawn briefing. The map of Ironwood Valley spread before them like a chessboard marked in blood. "More disciplined, better gear, and this time, they're not underestimating us. This is going to be a real fight, gentlemen." Fish had been tracking them from the ridgelines for hours, his reports calm but concerning. 3 distinct command elements, tight radio control, no chatter. They've got leadership, and they're keeping things clean. These guys aren't playing at war, they've done this before. Captain Raul Gutierrez, a man shaped by brutality and loss, had learned from El Lobo's failure. There would be no reckless charge, no overconfidence. Instead, he ordered a siege, cutting supply lines, jamming communication, establishing overwatch with snipers and emplacing machine gun nests in concentric rings around the ranch, turning the Thorn property into a cage he believed would slowly tighten until his prey broke under pressure. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't begin to comprehend, was that the 4 men inside that house had survived worse, had stared down sieges in the caves of Tora Bora and the rubble of Fallujah, had held positions against overwhelming odds with nothing but grit, trust, and a lifetime of combat carved into muscle and bone. For 3 long days, the siege dragged on, a cold, relentless grind where each side tested the other, probing for weaknesses, measuring resolve. But the Americans were not idle. Tommy, with fingers dancing over keyboards and wires, disrupted the cartel's communications with surgical precision, 1 node at a time vanishing in electronic silence. Fish's counter-sniper efforts crippled the enemy's overwatch, eliminating key shooters with silent shots that fell from nowhere. Jake's fortification, layered with interlocking arcs of fire and hidden fallback points, made any direct push suicidal, and Wade, orchestrating it all from within the heart of the storm, moved like a conductor, leading a symphony of controlled violence. On the 3rd night, as wind whispered through the valley and moonlight spilled across blood-stained grass, Wade made a decision that would end the siege not with attrition, but with precision. "Gentlemen," he said, with that quiet finality that always preceded violence, "we're going hunting." The plan was brutally elegant. Tommy would light up the eastern perimeter with timed detonations, drawing eyes and bodies away. Wade and Jake would breach the cartel's lines from the north and head straight for the command post. Fish would take overwatch, eliminating any reinforcement before it reached the inner circle. At 3 o'clock in the morning, fire erupted across the valley's eastern ridge, a storm of light and thunder erupting as Tommy's charges tore through the night, and as cartel forces scrambled in confusion, believing a breakout was underway. 2 shadows moved through the darkness from the opposite direction, with the silent certainty of predators in their element. Wade and Jake, ghosts in black, passed unseen, their steps calculated, their kills efficient. Blades and suppressed rounds turning sentries into quiet heaps before slipping through the enemy perimeter like smoke through cracks. They reached Gutierrez's mobile command post. Just as he leaned over a tactical map, his men oblivious to the final reckoning standing in the doorway, until Wade's voice filled the room like the voice of judgment itself. "Nobody move." 6 rifles froze. Gutierrez reached for steel, but Jake's barrel was already pressed to his temple. "Don't," Jake said flatly. "You're already dead. You just haven't figured it out yet." The interrogation that followed was swift and surgical. Wade's questions precise, his tone emotionless, and within minutes the cartel captain, now crumbling under the weight of terror and inevitability, surrendered everything: names, safe houses, supply routes, future shipments. The floodgates of operational intelligence opened, and by dawn, the team had mapped the entire cartel infrastructure operating across Montana. What followed was devastation delivered with clinical elegance, a series of raids, ambushes and surgical strikes that unfolded with the kind of brutal grace only honed through decades of war. Fish eliminated key command personnel before they could rally. Jake and Wade cleared fortified positions with coordinated violence that moved like poetry through darkness. Tommy orchestrated demolitions that wiped out vehicles, weapons caches, and communications hubs without harming a single innocent. One by one, every node of cartel power in the valley was destroyed. By Sunday morning, the operation was complete, 70 cartel operatives dead, the entire regional network dismantled, the valley silent once more. Law enforcement, armed with the intelligence extracted from Gutierrez and funneled through quiet channels, raided cartel operations across the state, sweeping up cells, arms, and assets. The message could not have been louder or clearer. The American heartland was not for sale. Not to drug lords, not to warlords, not to anyone. And for those who dared bring violence to its soil, men like Wade Thorne were still waiting. Not because they wanted war, but because they would never let it touch home without answering it with fire. Wade stood on his porch that Sunday morning, coffee in hand, the steam rising in lazy spirals as the first light of dawn spilled across Ironwood Valley, casting golden rays over the land he had bled to protect, a land that for the first time in days breathed in silence again, untouched by the crack of rifles or the thunder of explosives. The quiet, once a reminder of distance and isolation, now carried the resonance of something earned, something defended, a stillness paid for in blood. As he watched the sun rise over the ridgelines, the echoes of the past week played softly in the corners of his mind, muzzle flashes in the dark, whispered comms. The finality of lead meeting flesh, reminders of the skills and instincts that had never truly left him, only lain dormant beneath a layer of dust and good intentions. His teammates had already gone, fading back into their civilian lives, with the satisfaction that only men of their kind understood. Jobs completed, debts honored, bonds intact. But each had left behind more than memories. They had left a phone number and a promise carved in steel. If ever the call came again, they would answer without hesitation. The official investigation into what became known, publicly, as the Ironwood Valley incident, concluded with the carefully constructed narrative Wade and his team had orchestrated. A cartel-on-cartel territorial conflict, bloody but internal, complete with fabricated ballistics, forged radio intercepts, and staged witness statements that pointed in every direction but the truth. No trace remained of Delta's hand, only the lingering question of how an entire cartel cell had vanished so completely from the face of Montana. 6 months later, when a senior DEA official, a former Marine named Johnson, whose eyes held the same weight Wade recognized in mirrors, arrived under a sealed file to thank him unofficially, the words were few but heavy. "Whatever happened out here," the agent said, "sent a message. They're afraid now, and that's worth more than you know." Wade's reply was simple, quiet and honest. "Just doing my civic duty, Agent Johnson. Sometimes the old ways are still the right ways." Life on the ranch resumed its slow rhythm, cattle moving through pasture, tractors humming across fields, neighbors waving from dusty trucks. But beneath the ordinary facade, the war had left its mark. The reinforcements, built during the siege, remained in place, weapons cached in underground bunkers, disguised as storage sheds, surveillance integrated into ordinary farm equipment, kill zones mapped and memorized. Wade knew this wasn't the end. Cartels were hydras, always regrowing, but he also knew he was ready, and more importantly, he was no longer alone. The legend of what had happened in Ironwood Valley began to circulate quietly through the ranks of the Special Operations community. Not in headlines or debriefs, but in whispered stories told in barracks, training centers, and shadowed corners of secure facilities. A tale of how 4 retired Delta Force operatives had taken on an entire cartel and wiped it from the map without backup, without recognition and failure. It became required reading at West Point and unofficial doctrine in JSOC classrooms, a living reminder that warrior ethos didn't end with retirement, and that the homeland could still count on its ghost. Offers for consultation began to trickle in, discreet and deniable. Wade's name, or at least his call sign, had regained weight within intelligence circles, and his experience in the valley had exposed tactical vulnerabilities in cartel operations that federal agencies were eager to explore. He agreed to share what he knew, on one condition: his identity remained classified. The Phantom had returned to the shadows, not because he feared the light, but because the fight had never been about glory. Meanwhile, neighbors came and went, oblivious to the quiet transformation around them. The gun ports were hidden in eaves, the satellite relays tucked beneath weather vanes, the root cellar not a pantry, but an armory. To most, Wade Thorne was just a retired vet, living the quiet Montana life, a solitary man with a distant stare and a firm handshake. But to those who knew what to look for, who saw the alert way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the horizon with quiet calculation, it was clear that the warrior still stood at the gate. Sheriff Mike Connor, himself a former Army Ranger, never asked questions he didn't want answers to, but he watched the official reports with skepticism and the valley with respect, understanding instinctively that sometimes justice isn't written down, it's buried in the silence between shots. And as word of the Valley massacre reached cartel ears through fragmented whispers and terrified survivors, something began to change. A psychological ripple spread through the underworld, warning in unspoken terms that the American heartland was no longer a passive frontier, but a battlefield patrolled by men who didn't wear uniforms or carry badges, men who answered threats not with politics but precision. That fear, that whisper of invisible retaliation, did what no border wall or federal task force had managed. It made the cartel pause. It made them afraid, and Wade Thorne, standing alone on his porch, coffee in hand and eyes scanning the horizon, knew that this was the greatest victory of all. Not just the bodies buried or the operations shut down, but the idea now planted deep within the minds of every would-be invader, that in some quiet corner of America, there are still wolves watching the fences. Wade stood once more on the porch of his weathered Montana ranch, the fading warmth of the day lingering on the wind as he sipped his coffee and gazed out across the valley that had, in the span of a single week, transformed from peaceful refuge to battleground, and ultimately to sacred ground, a place not merely defended, but consecrated by the righteous fury of warriors who had answered the call one final time. Yet beneath the surface of tactical precision and flawless execution, Wade's personal transformation had run just as deep as the strategic victory they'd earned. For 3 long years, he had wandered the quiet edges of civilian life like a ghost without a war, struggling to find purpose beyond the uniform, haunted by silence that offered no mission, no enemy, no cause until the enemy came to him, and in defending his land, his home and the soul of the country he had sworn to protect, he discovered that the Phantom had never truly retired, only waited, patient and coiled, for a threat worthy of reawakening. The operation had reunited him with the only brothers he had ever truly known, men who spoke in glances, fought in perfect rhythm, and trusted each other with the kind of quiet certainty forged only through blood and fire. And though they had departed once the mission was complete, they had left behind something more powerful than gear or guns. They had left behind a promise. What they had accomplished together would echo far beyond the fences of the ranch. Intelligence gathered during the mission had been quietly fed into the veins of national defense, leading to cascading victories across the region. Shuttered safe houses, intercepted shipments, and fractured networks that had once believed themselves untouchable. Yet it wasn't the firepower that broke the enemy's will. It was the psychological shockwave, the unspoken message that rippled through the underworld. Rural America was not undefended, and those who dared to invade it would face retribution not from red tape, but from men like Wade Thorne. The technology, the tactics, the terrain, all had played a role, but the operation's greatest revelation was human, the enduring power of training, instinct and resolve, that no time or title could erase. Tommy's silent genius in the digital realm, Fish's godlike precision from the shadows, Jake's impenetrable calm under pressure, all had converged into a singular proof that small, skilled teams, rooted in experience and brotherhood, could hold the line where entire institutions might fall. And Wade, their anchor and orchestrator, had not merely survived, he had been reborn. The ranch, once a place of exile and unfinished endings, now stood as a quiet fortress layered in deception and readiness, root cellars that housed not produce but munition, antennas that looked like weather instruments but transmitted encrypted signals to eyes that watched the borders of civilized. Local law enforcement, including the ever-watchful Sheriff Connor, had sensed the truth behind the classified reports, but asked no questions, recognizing that sometimes silence served the greater good. As intelligence agencies quietly incorporated lessons learned from Ironwood Valley into future doctrine, and as Wade declined every interview, every award, and every trace of recognition, he began to understand something that had eluded him since the day he folded his uniform. His mission had never ended. It had only changed shape. The Phantom had not returned to chase ghosts. He had returned to become the shadow in the doorway, the voice behind the warning, the hand that would not hesitate when danger came knocking again. The ranch was quiet now, but it was the quiet of a loaded rifle, of a calm breath before the trigger breaks. The war against international threats would continue, but now deep in the American heartland, there existed a place where enemies would never find safe ground, and a man who would greet them not with fear but with fire. And in that solemn vow renewed with every sunrise and sealed in the blood of those who had tested him, Wade Thorne had found peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing that when the next storm came, he would meet it head-on, unflinching, unyielding and unafraid, because some old soldiers never fade. They simply wait, and when the wolves come to the gate, they rise.